The men laughed when Margaret Hayes began plastering the inside of her cabin walls with mud and straw in September 1879. They called it women's work done wrong. They said she was wasting time on decoration when she should be focused on survival. They said a woman alone on a Wyoming homestead had no business trying to build shelter without a man's guidance. They said mud belonged outside a cabin, not inside. They said she'd freeze to death come winter because she didn't understand how real frontier construction worked. By February 1880, those same men were begging to know her methods. Margaret's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 48 degrees when the exterior temperature was 13 below zero. Every other cabin in the settlement struggled to stay above 15 degrees, despite burning twice the firewood. The men who'd called her useless were burning through their winter fuel supplies at unsustainable rates, watching their families shiver and realizing that the woman they'd mocked understood something about heat and shelter that none of them had grasped. Margaret Hayes was 34 years old, widowed, and claiming a homestead alone in a territory where women landowners were rare enough to be remarkable and distrusted enough to face constant skepticism. She'd arrived in Wyoming in May 1879 after her husband died of typhoid in Kansas. She had two choices: return to her family in Massachusetts and live as a dependent spinster, or file a homestead claim under her own name and build a life on her own terms. She chose the homestead. The men in the settlement thought she'd fail within months. They thought wrong about everything. The story of how Margaret Hayes built the warmest cabin in Wyoming Territory, using methods every man dismissed as foolish, begins not with construction techniques learned from frontier experts, but with knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood something men rarely thought about: how heat actually moves through a space, and how the materials inside a structure matter as much as the materials of the walls themselves. Wyoming Territory in 1879 was harsh, remote, and dominated by men. The few women who came west typically arrived as wives, daughters, or in some cases prostitutes serving the mining camps and railroad towns. A woman filing a homestead claim alone was unusual enough to attract attention and skepticism. When that woman was a widow in her 30s with no male relatives to assist her, the skepticism intensified. Margaret Hayes understood what she was facing. She'd grown up in Massachusetts in a family of modest means. Her father had been a mason, her mother a seamstress. Margaret had learned practical skills from both parents, basic construction principles from watching her father work, and detailed knowledge of textiles, insulation, and heat management from her mother. She'd married at 21, moved west with her husband seeking opportunity, and found herself widowed at 33 after 7 years of marriage that had produced no children. The homestead, she claimed, was 160 acres of rolling grassland in southeastern Wyoming, near the small settlement of Pine Bluffs. The land wasn't prime agricultural territory, but it was available, and Margaret had enough money saved to file the claim and survive the first year if she was careful. What she didn't have was the automatic respect accorded to male homesteaders. The land office clerk had tried to talk her out of filing. The men in Pine Bluffs had made their opinions clear. She wouldn't last a month. A woman alone couldn't build a proper cabin, couldn't break ground for plowing, couldn't handle livestock, couldn't survive a Wyoming winter. Margaret ignored them all. She had a plan, knowledge they didn't respect, and determination born from having no acceptable alternatives. She would succeed or she would die trying. Either outcome was better than returning east in defeat. The first challenge was building a cabin that met homestead requirements, at least 10 by 12 feet, with a door and a window. Most male homesteaders in the area built quickly, using standard log construction if timber was available, or sod construction if it wasn't. Margaret's land had limited timber, mostly cottonwood along a seasonal creek. Cutting, hauling, and raising logs would be difficult for a woman working alone. Sod construction seemed more practical. But Margaret had observed something during her years in Kansas before coming to Wyoming. She'd seen sod houses that stayed remarkably cool in summer but frigid in winter. She'd also seen sod houses that maintained more stable temperatures. The difference wasn't in the sod walls themselves, but in how the interior was finished. The warmest sod houses had interior walls that had been plastered with clay or mud mixtures. The coldest ones had bare sod exposed to the interior space. She asked about this once in Kansas, mentioning it to a woman whose sod house stayed notably warm. The woman, a German immigrant, had explained that sod alone breathed too much. Cold air infiltrated through the porous material, but a good clay plaster on the interior sealed the surface, stopped air infiltration, and added thermal mass that absorbed heat during the day and released it at night. It was an old technique from Europe, the woman said, that American men seemed to have forgotten or never learned. Margaret remembered that conversation. When she began planning her Wyoming cabin, she incorporated that principle into her design. She would build with sod, but she would finish the interior in a way that none of the men around her bothered with. Margaret started building in June 1879. She hired 2 men from Pine Bluffs to help with the initial heavy work, cutting sod blocks and positioning the first few courses. Sod construction required cutting thick rectangles of prairie sod, roots and all, and stacking them like bricks. Each block weighed 40 to 60 pounds. Cutting and placing them was back-breaking labor. The men she hired worked for 3 days, laying the foundation and the first 4 courses of walls. They did adequate work, but they made their opinions clear. "This is the strangest job I've had," one said, "helping a woman build a house she won't be able to finish or live in." "Why won't I be able to finish it?" Margaret asked. "Because it's too much work for a woman alone. You'll get halfway done and realize you can't do it. Then you'll either hire it finished or give up." "I appreciate your confidence," Margaret said dryly, and paid them for their 3 days. After they left, she continued alone. The work was brutal, cutting sod blocks with a specialized plow blade, loading them onto a wooden sledge, dragging the sledge to the construction site, lifting each block into position. Her hands blistered, then calloused. Her back ached constantly, but the walls rose slowly, one course, then another, then another. The men from Pine Bluffs would ride out occasionally to watch her progress. They'd shake their heads, offer unsolicited advice, and predict failure. "You're building too slow," one said. "Winter will come before you're done." "Then I'll work faster," Margaret replied. "Sod walls need to be thicker than what you're building. Those walls won't hold heat. They'll be adequate. You're wasting your time. A woman can't homestead alone." Margaret didn't respond to that. She just kept working. By late July, the walls were 5 feet high. By mid-August, they reached 7 feet. Margaret built her roof structure from cottonwood poles she cut and hauled from the creek. The roof was a simple shed design, sloping from 7 feet at the high wall to 6 feet at the low wall. Over the poles, she laid a thick layer of prairie grass, then sod blocks, creating a living roof. The weight was substantial, but sod construction could support heavy roofs well. She installed a door she'd purchased in Pine Bluffs, simple but functional. She fitted a small glass window on the south wall. By early September, the basic structure was weatherproof. Most male homesteaders would have considered the cabin finished at this point. Margaret was just beginning the work that mattered. On September 10, 1879, Margaret began the interior work that would make her cabin exceptional. She started by gathering clay from a deposit she'd found a half-mile from her cabin. Wyoming had clay soils in many areas, and she'd identified a particularly good source, clay that was plastic when wet but dried hard and crack-resistant. She hauled the clay back to her cabin in buckets, trip after trip, until she had several hundred pounds stockpiled inside. Then she began mixing it with water and prairie grass cut into short lengths. The grass would act as reinforcement, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried. This was the same principle used in adobe construction, but Margaret was using it as an interior plaster, not as bricks. The men who saw her doing this were baffled. "Why are you putting mud on the inside of your walls?" one asked. "To seal them," Margaret said, continuing her work. "Sod doesn't need sealing. It's already solid. Sod is porous. Air moves through it. This plaster stops air infiltration." "That's not how it works. Air doesn't move through sod walls." Margaret paused her work. "Have you ever measured the temperature in a sod house with bare walls versus one with plastered walls?" "Don't need to measure it. Everyone knows how sod houses work." "I've lived in both," Margaret said. "The plastered ones are warmer, significantly warmer." The man shook his head. "You're wasting time on decoration. That mud will just fall off come winter when moisture gets into it." Margaret returned to her plastering. The technique required patience. She applied the clay mixture in a thin layer, perhaps a 1/4 inch thick, pressing it firmly against the sod surface. She worked in sections, allowing each section to partially dry before moving to the next. The goal was complete coverage with no gaps, creating a continuous sealed surface across all interior walls. But Margaret added an innovation that went beyond simple plastering. She'd remembered something her mother had taught her about maintaining warmth in cold rooms. Dense materials near heat sources absorb warmth and release it slowly. Her mother had used this principle when heating rooms with minimal fuel, positioning stones or bricks near the fireplace to capture and radiate heat. Margaret incorporated this into her plaster. Before applying the clay to areas near where her fireplace would be, she pressed small stones into the sod wall, creating a matrix of stone partially embedded in the sod. Then she plastered over the stones, creating a surface that had significantly more thermal mass than simple clay plaster alone. The stones would absorb heat from the fireplace, hold it, and release it slowly over hours. This technique was visible to anyone who looked, but none of the men who visited understood what they were seeing. They saw mud and stones on the walls and assumed it was some kind of primitive decoration or a woman's attempt at making the cabin pretty. They didn't understand thermal mass. They didn't understand that Margaret was building a heat battery into her walls. The plastering took 3 weeks. Margaret covered every interior surface, all 4 walls from floor to ceiling. She took special care around gaps and seams, ensuring complete air sealing. When she finished, the interior of her cabin looked unusual by frontier standards. Most cabins had bare log or sod interiors. Margaret's had smooth, clay-finished walls that looked almost like interior plaster in an eastern house. The men's mockery intensified. "She's built a mud palace," one joked. "Real pretty. Won't do a thing to keep her warm, but it looks nice. All that work for decoration," another said. "Should have spent that time cutting more firewood." Margaret had also cut firewood, a substantial amount, but she'd done it efficiently, focusing on deadfall cottonwood that was already dry and required no seasoning. She'd built a covered firewood storage area attached to her cabin's north wall, and she'd filled it with several cords of wood. Not as much as some of the men had stockpiled, but more than several others. "You won't make it through winter with that much wood," a settler named Bill Thompson told her. "You need twice that. Maybe 3 times. "I believe I have sufficient," Margaret said. "You believe wrong. Wyoming winter burns through firewood fast. You'll be cutting wood in January, freezing while you work. Then I'll cut wood in January." Thompson shook his head. "Stubborn woman, gonna learn the hard way." Margaret's fireplace design was the second element that separated her cabin from others. Most settlers built simple fireplaces, a firebox made from stacked stones, a chimney rising above the roof, functional but not optimized for heat retention. Margaret built her fireplace against the center of the north wall, but she extended it significantly into the interior space. The firebox was standard size, but the stone structure around it was massive. She hauled river stones from the creek, hundreds of them, building a fireplace that weighed perhaps 2 tons. The stone mass extended 3 feet into the room, creating a structure that dominated the cabin's interior. The men who saw it thought it was excessive. "That's way more fireplace than you need," Thompson said. "You've wasted a month hauling rocks for something that could have been half that size." "The mass stores heat," Margaret explained. "Stores heat? Fire makes heat. You don't need to store it. When the fire dies down, the stones continue radiating warmth. It maintains the cabin temperature without constant burning." Thompson looked skeptical. "Never heard of such a thing. Fire goes out, cabin gets cold. That's how it works." "That's how it works in a cabin without thermal mass," Margaret corrected. "In this cabin, it works differently." She also incorporated another feature that drew mockery, a stone bench built into each side of the fireplace, extending from the main structure. These benches were positioned at sitting height, creating places to sit that were in direct contact with the heated stone mass. The men thought she was building furniture, wasting more effort on comfort rather than focusing on survival necessities. But Margaret understood something they didn't. In deep winter, when cold became dangerous, having a warm place to sit, a mass of heated stone that radiated warmth directly to your body, could mean the difference between maintaining core temperature and slowly succumbing to hypothermia. The benches weren't furniture. They were survival tools. By October 15, 1879, Margaret's cabin was complete. She moved her possessions inside: basic furniture, cooking equipment, supplies for winter, her saved money, carefully hidden, and books. The men in Pine Bluffs considered her prepared for failure. They gave her until December before she'd give up and leave. The first snow came on October 28th, earlier than usual. Just a dusting, but it signaled winter's approach. Temperature dropped to 20 degrees overnight. Margaret lit her first fire in her new fireplace, a modest fire using a reasonable amount of wood. She wanted to see how the cabin performed. The results surprised even her. The cabin warmed quickly. The clay-plastered walls absorbed heat from the air and radiated it back into the space. The stone fireplace mass heated slowly but steadily. Within 2 hours, the interior temperature reached 55 degrees. She let the fire die down to coals, then to nothing, and monitored the temperature drop. Over the next 8 hours, the interior temperature dropped only 7 degrees. The thermal mass of the fireplace was releasing stored heat. The sealed, plastered walls were preventing heat loss through air infiltration. The sod walls themselves, though not exceptional insulators, were adequate when combined combined with Margaret's interior modifications. She ran comparison tests over the next week, burning fires of different sizes, monitoring how long the cabin retained heat, calculating her firewood consumption. Her projections were encouraging. She could maintain comfortable temperatures using roughly half the firewood she'd initially estimated. On November 3rd, Bill Thompson stopped by to check on her before winter set in earnest. "How are you managing?" he asked, expecting to hear complaints. "Quite well," Margaret said. "Getting cold at night? The cabin stays comfortable." Thompson looked skeptical. "It's barely below freezing. Wait until it gets really cold. You'll see. I'm confident in my preparation." "That confidence won't keep you warm when it's 20 below, but good luck to you." He rode away, certain she'd be begging for help within months. November brought steadily colder temperatures and several snowfalls. By late month, daytime highs were in the teens, nighttime lows dropped to near zero. This was cold enough that other settlers were burning significantly more firewood, but Margaret's cabin maintained warmth efficiently. She burned 2 modest fires daily, morning and evening, each lasting about 2 hours. Between fires, the thermal mass kept the cabin comfortable. She noticed something else. The clay-plastered walls absorbed moisture from her cooking and breathing, then released it slowly, maintaining moderate humidity that made the air feel warmer than it actually was. Dry air feels colder than humid air at the same temperature. The men's cabins, with bare log or sod interiors, stayed dry and felt colder. Margaret's cabin maintained slight humidity and felt warmer. December brought the real cold. Temperatures dropped to 10 below, then 15 below. Wind screamed across the prairie, creating wind chills far worse than the actual temperature. This was the weather that tested every structure and every preparation. Margaret's cabin performed exceptionally. Even on the coldest nights, with exterior temperatures at 15 below zero, her interior temperature never dropped below 40 degrees. She burned slightly larger fires than in November, but her total firewood consumption was still well below what neighboring homesteaders were using. On December 18th, a settler named James Morrison stopped at her cabin during a supply run. He looked exhausted. "Mrs. Hayes, I need to ask your advice." "Come in," Margaret said, opening her door. Morrison stepped inside and immediately felt the temperature difference. "My God, it's warm in here." "Comfortable enough." "How?" Morrison looked around the cabin, studying the plastered walls, the massive fireplace. "My cabin is freezing. We're burning wood constantly, and we can barely keep it above 20 degrees inside." "Tell me about your cabin construction." "Standard log construction. Good tight logs, decent chinking, nothing fancy, but solid." "Is your interior finished?" "Finished." "Do you have bare logs exposed to your interior space? Or have you sealed them in any way?" "They're bare logs. Why would I cover them?" Margaret explained her reasoning. "Air infiltration through porous materials, thermal mass principles, the importance of sealing interior surfaces." Morrison listened with increasing attention. "I've never heard of any of this," he said finally. "Is this common knowledge back east?" "Among women, sometimes. My mother knew these principles. Her mother knew them. Women who managed household warming with limited fuel learned what worked. And men don't know this? In my experience, men focus on the structure itself, the strength and integrity of walls and roofs. Women focus on the interior environment, how to make a space livable with whatever resources are available. Different knowledge. Morrison stayed for an hour, taking notes. Margaret explained everything: the clay plaster technique, the importance of complete air sealing, the thermal mass concept, the efficiency gains from proper interior finish. When he left, he was determined to modify his own cabin's interior. January 1880 brought the coldest weather Wyoming Territory had experienced in years. Temperatures dropped to 25 below zero and stayed there for days. Wind never stopped. Snow accumulated in massive drifts. Travel between homesteads became dangerous. Every settler was isolated, depending entirely on their own preparation and their cabin's performance. Margaret's cabin maintained an interior temperature of 45 to 50 degrees throughout the worst cold. She burned larger fires, certainly, using more wood than she had in milder weather, but her consumption was still manageable. She was using perhaps 3/4 of a cord per week from a stockpile of several cords. She would make it through winter with wood to spare. Her neighbors were in crisis. Bill Thompson's cabin, with bare log walls and a small fireplace, couldn't maintain temperature above 20 degrees despite burning massive amounts of wood. Thompson was going through more than a cord per week, and his stockpile was dwindling dangerously. The Morrison family was in similar difficulty. Several other homesteaders were burning through firewood at unsustainable rates. On January 14th, Bill Thompson's wife Sarah appeared at Margaret's door, half frozen from the journey. "Please," Sarah said. "Bill is too proud to ask, but we need help. We're almost out of firewood, and our cabin is so cold the children can't stop shivering." Margaret didn't hesitate. Bring your family here. Stay until the cold breaks. Bill won't. I don't care about Bill's pride. Bring your children before they freeze. The Thompson family arrived that evening. Bill, Sarah, and 3 children. They crowded into Margaret's cabin, and for the first time, Bill Thompson understood what Margaret had built. The cabin wasn't just warmer than his. It was warmer by 30 degrees. His cabin struggled to maintain 20 degrees. Margaret's cabin was 50 degrees, comfortable enough that the children could remove their heavy coats. "How is this possible?" Bill asked, staring at the plastered walls. Margaret explained everything again: the air sealing, the thermal mass, the efficiency principles. Bill listened in silence, realizing that every criticism he'd made, every mockery he'd voiced, had been completely wrong. "I called you useless," he said quietly. "I said a woman couldn't build a proper cabin. I remember. I was wrong about everything. You've built the best cabin in the territory, and I built one that's killing my family." "Your cabin can be improved," Margaret said. "When the weather breaks, I'll help you plaster your interior. It's not too late to fix it." The Thompsons stayed 3 days. By the time they left, Bill had filled several pages with notes about Margaret's techniques. He'd examined every detail of her construction, asked dozens of questions, and gained understanding of principles he'd never considered. Word spread rapidly. Other settlers sought Margaret's advice. She shared her knowledge freely, explaining the techniques to anyone who asked. Some implemented her methods immediately, plastering their interiors midwinter with whatever materials they could gather. Others waited for spring to make modifications, but everyone acknowledged that the woman they'd called useless had built a cabin superior to anything the men had constructed. The temperature measurements were undeniable. On January 22nd, when the exterior temperature was 13 below zero, Margaret's cabin maintained 48 degrees interior temperature. Bill Thompson's cabin, just 2 miles away, was at 15 degrees despite burning twice the wood Margaret was using. James Morrison's cabin was at 18 degrees. Other homesteads reported similar numbers. Interior temperatures 20 to 35 degrees colder than Margaret's, despite using more fuel. The difference wasn't minor. It was the difference between discomfort and genuine warmth, between barely surviving and living comfortably, between burning through your entire winter fuel supply in 6 weeks and having wood left over in March. The physics behind Margaret's success was straightforward, though unfamiliar to most frontier settlers. Heat loss in buildings occurs through 4 mechanisms: conduction through materials, convection through air movement, radiation from warm surfaces to cold surfaces, and infiltration of cold air through gaps and porous materials. Standard frontier cabins addressed only the first 2 mechanisms, and poorly. Log or sod walls provided moderate insulation, reducing conduction. Ceiling doors and windows reduced some convection, but infiltration was largely ignored. Most cabins had porous interior surfaces, bare logs or bare sod, that allowed air to move through them. Cold exterior air infiltrated into the living space continuously, carrying away warmth. Margaret's clay plaster addressed infiltration directly. By creating a sealed, non-porous interior surface, she prevented air from moving through the walls. This had multiple effects. First, it prevented warm interior air from escaping through the walls. Second, it prevented cold exterior air from entering. Third, and most importantly, it created a stable interior air mass that could be heated and retained. The thermal mass principle was equally important. Materials like stone, clay, and brick have high heat capacity, meaning they can absorb large amounts of heat without large temperature increases. When heated by a fire, these materials store energy. When the fire dies down, they release that energy slowly as radiation and convection, maintaining air temperature. Margaret's stone fireplace, weighing approximately 2 tons, could store massive amounts of heat. A 2-hour fire would heat that stone mass, which would then radiate warmth for 10 to 12 hours. Standard small fireplaces lacked this mass, so when the fire died, heat generation stopped immediately and cabin temperature dropped rapidly. The combination of sealed interior surfaces and high thermal mass created a system that was 4 to 5 times more efficient than standard cabin construction. Margaret's cabin required roughly 1/4 the fuel to maintain temperature 30 degrees higher than neighboring cabins. The efficiency gain was extraordinary. The moisture management aspect was an additional benefit Margaret hadn't fully anticipated. Clay plaster is hygroscopic, meaning it absorbs and releases moisture. In winter, when the air inside her cabin became dry from heating, the clay walls released moisture, maintaining humidity around 40 to 50%. This made the air feel warmer and more comfortable. In summer, when humidity rose from cooking and other activities, the clay absorbed excess, Moisture, preventing the cabin from feeling damp. Standard cabins with bare wood or sod interiors couldn't regulate humidity. Winter air in these cabins often dropped below 20% humidity, making the space feel colder and causing respiratory discomfort. Margaret's cabin maintained comfort not just through temperature but through humidity management. The cold broke in late February. By March, temperatures were above freezing during the day, and the worst of winter was clearly over. Margaret had burned through approximately 2/3 of her firewood stockpile. Several of her neighbors had burned through all their wood and had been forced to burn furniture, floorboards, or anything else combustible. As weather warmed and travel became safer, Margaret received dozens of visitors. Homesteaders from throughout the region came to see her cabin and learn her methods. She welcomed everyone, explained her techniques in detail, and helped people understand the principles so they could implement them in their own circumstances. Bill Thompson became her strongest advocate. "I've lived on the frontier for 8 years," he told a gathering of settlers in Pine Bluffs. "I thought I knew how to build a proper cabin. Margaret Hayes taught me that I knew nothing. The woman we called useless built a cabin warmer than any man's, using less firewood, and she did it with methods none of us understood. We should have been learning from her instead of mocking her." By the summer of 1880, nearly every homestead in the area was implementing some version of Margaret's techniques. Interior plastering became standard practice. Homesteaders mixed clay or lime plaster or even simple mud and sealed their interior walls. The results were consistent: warmer cabins, reduced firewood consumption, more comfortable living conditions. The thermal mass principle spread more slowly because it required building or modifying fireplaces, more labor-intensive than plastering. But several settlers rebuilt their fireplaces with significant stone mass, and all reported improved heat retention. Margaret proved up her homestead claim in 1884, gaining full ownership of her 160 acres. She married in 1886 a widower named Robert Chen, who had filed a neighboring claim. They built a larger house using advanced versions of Margaret's techniques: plastered interior walls, massive stone fireplace, careful attention to air sealing and thermal management. The house stayed warm in winter and cool in summer with minimal fuel use. Margaret became known throughout Wyoming Territory as an expert in efficient cabin design. She consulted on numerous construction projects, always emphasizing the same principles: seal your interior surfaces, incorporate thermal mass near heat sources, understand that materials matter as much as structure. Her knowledge was sought by homesteaders, by the army building frontier outposts, even by mining companies constructing bunkhouses in cold mountain areas. The gender aspect of her story remained significant. Margaret had been dismissed because she was a woman, and her knowledge had been mocked because it came from women's work, the domestic science of managing household warmth with limited resources. But that knowledge proved superior to standard male construction practices when tested by hard winter. The men learned eventually. They learned that women's knowledge about interior spaces, about heat management, about efficiency and comfort was technical knowledge as valid as anything they'd learned about carpentry or masonry. They learned that dismissing knowledge based on its source was foolish, and they learned that useless was sometimes just another word for different, and different methods could be better methods. Margaret Hayes died in 1921 at age 76. Her obituary in the Cheyenne newspaper called her the woman who taught Wyoming how to stay warm. The cabin she built in 1879 stood until 1935, when it was finally replaced by a modern structure. But the techniques she introduced persisted. Interior plastering became standard practice in Wyoming homestead construction. Thermal mass fireplaces became common. The understanding that interior finish mattered as much as exterior structure became accepted wisdom. Modern historical analysis recognizes Margaret Hayes as an important innovator in frontier architecture. Her techniques weren't entirely original. Many had been used in various forms in Europe and other cold climates for centuries. But she brought that knowledge to the American frontier, adapted it to local materials and conditions, and proved its effectiveness when everyone assumed she'd fail. The lesson remains relevant. Knowledge exists in unexpected places. The person everyone dismisses might have the most valuable information, and sometimes the woman working with mud and stones understands thermal dynamics better than the men building with proper methods. Margaret's cabin stayed 35 degrees warmer than the men's cabins, not through luck or accident, but through knowledge, careful application of physical principles, and the courage to ignore mockery and build according to her own understanding. Everyone called her useless. Her cabin proved them wrong in the most quantifiable way possible, by maintaining 48 degrees when others struggled to reach 15 degrees, by keeping families alive and comfortable while standard cabins barely kept people from freezing, by demonstrating that women's knowledge about warmth and shelter was technical expertise deserving respect. The settlers learned their lesson the hard way, freezing in their inadequate cabins while the useless woman stayed warm in her mud-plastered fortress. It was a lesson that spread across Wyoming Territory and beyond, changing how people thought about construction, gender, and the sources of knowledge worth respecting.